Part the Second, Chapter 4 of Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He was a handy man at his trade, an all-round man, as artisans in country towns are apt to be. In London the man who carves the boss or knob of leafage declines to cut the fragment of moulding which merges in that leafage, as if it were a degradation to do the second half of one whole. When there was not much Gothic moulding for Jude to run, nor much window tracery on the bankers, he would go out lettering monuments or tombstones, and take a pleasure in the change of handiwork. The next time that he saw her was when he was on a ladder executing a job of this sort inside one of the churches. There was a short morning service, and when the parson entered, Jude came down from his ladder and sat with the half-dozen people forming the congregation till the prayer should be ended and he could resume his tapping. He did not observe till the service was half over that one of the women was Sue, who had perforce accompanied the elderly Miss Fontover thither. Jude sat watching her pretty shoulders, her easy, curiously nonchalant risings and sittings, and her perfunctory genuflections, and thought what a help such an Anglican would have been to him in happier circumstances. It was not so much his anxiety to get on with his work that made him go up to it immediately the worshippers began to take their leave. It was that he dared not, in this holy spot, confront the woman who was beginning to influence him in such an indescribable manner. Those three enormous reasons why he must not attempt intimate acquaintance with Sue Bridehead, now that his interest in her had shown itself to be unmistakably of a sexual kind, loomed as stubbornly as ever. But it was also obvious that man could not live by work alone, that the particular man, Jude, at any rate, wanted something to love. Some men would have rushed incontinently to her, snatched the pleasure of easy friendship which she could hardly refuse, and have left the rest to chance. Not so Jude, at first. But as the days, and still more particularly the lonely evenings, dragged along, he found himself, to his moral consternation, to be thinking more of her instead of thinking less of her, and experiencing a fearful bliss in doing what was erratic, informal, and unexpected. Surrounded by her influence all day, walking past the spots she frequented, he was always thinking of her, and was obliged to own to himself that his conscience was likely to be the loser in this battle. To be sure, she was almost an ideality to him still. Perhaps to know her would be to cure himself of this unexpected and unauthorized passion. A voice whispered that, though he desired to know her, he did not desire to be cured. There was not the least doubt that, from his own orthodox point of view, the situation was growing immoral. For Sue to be the loved one of a man who was licensed by the laws of his country to love Arabella and none other unto his life's end, was a pretty bad second beginning when the man was bent on such a course as Jude purposed. This conviction was so real with him that one day when, as was frequent, he was at work in a neighbouring village church alone, he felt it to be his duty to pray against his weakness. But much as he wished to be an exemplar in these things, he could not get on. It was quite impossible, he found, to ask to be delivered from temptation when your heart's desire was to be tempted unto 70 times 7. So he excused himself. "After all," he said, "it is not altogether an erotolepsy that is the matter with me, as at that first time. I can see that she is exceptionally bright, and it is partly a wish for intellectual sympathy and a craving for loving kindness in my solitude." Thus he went on adoring her, fearing to realize that it was human perversity. For whatever Sue's virtues, talents, or ecclesiastical saturation, it was certain that those items were not at all the cause of his affection for her. On an afternoon at this time a young girl entered the stonemason's yard with some hesitation, and, lifting her skirts to avoid dragging them in the white dust, crossed towards the office. "That's a nice girl," said one of the men known as Uncle Joe. "Who is she?" asked another. "I don't know. I've seen her about here and there. Why, yes, she's the daughter of that clever chap Bridehead, who did all the raw ironwork at St. Silas's 10 years ago, and went away to London afterwards. I don't know what he's doing now. Not much, I fancy, as she's come back here." Meanwhile the young woman had knocked at the office door, and asked if Mr. Jude Fawley was at work in the yard. It so happened that Jude had gone out somewhere or other that afternoon, which information she received with a look of disappointment, and went away immediately. When Jude returned they told him, and described her, whereupon he exclaimed, "Why, that's my cousin Sue!" He looked along the street after her, but she was out of sight. He had no longer any thought of a conscientious avoidance of her, and resolved to call upon her that very evening. And when he reached his lodging he found a note from her, a first note, one of those documents which, simple and commonplace in themselves, are seen retrospectively to have been pregnant with impassioned consequences. The very unconsciousness of a looming drama which is shown in such innocent first epistles from women to men, or vice versa, makes them, when such a drama follows, and they are read over by the purple or lurid light of it, all the more impressive, solemn, and, in cases, terrible. Sue's was of the most artless and natural kind. She addressed him as her dear cousin Jude, said she had only just learnt by the merest accident that he was living in Christminster, and reproached him with not letting her know. They might have had such nice times together, she said, for she was thrown much upon herself, and had hardly any congenial friend. But now there was every probability of her soon going away, so that the chance of companionship would be lost perhaps for ever. A cold sweat overspread Jude at the news that she was going away. That was a contingency he had never thought of, and it spurred him to write all the more quickly to her. He would meet her that very evening, he said, 1 hour from the time of writing, at the cross in the pavement which marked the spot of the martyrdoms. When he had dispatched the note by a boy, he regretted that in his hurry he should have suggested to her to meet him out of doors, when he might have said he would call upon her. It was, in fact, the country custom to meet thus, and nothing else had occurred to him. Arabella had been met in the same way, unfortunately, and it might not seem respectable to a dear girl like Sue. However, it could not be helped now, and he moved towards the point a few minutes before the hour under the glimmer of the newly lighted lamps. The broad street was silent, and almost deserted, although it was not late. He saw a figure on the other side, which turned out to be hers, and they both converged towards the cross-mark at the same moment. Before either had reached it, she called out to him, "I am not going to meet you just there for the first time in my life. Come further on." The voice, though positive and silvery, had been tremulous. They walked on in parallel lines, and, waiting her pleasure, Jude watched till she showed signs of closing in, when he did likewise, the place being where the carrier's carts stood in the daytime, though there was none on the spot then. "I am sorry that I asked you to meet me, and didn't call," began Jude, with the bashfulness of a lover, "but I thought it would save time if we were going to walk." "Oh, I don't mind that," she said with the freedom of a friend. "I have really no place to ask anybody into. What I meant was that the place you chose was so horrid. I suppose I ought not to say horrid. I mean gloomy and inauspicious in its associations. But isn't it funny to begin like this, when I don't know you yet?" She looked him up and down curiously, though Jude did not look much at her. "You seem to know me more than I know you," she added. "Yes, I have seen you now and then." "And you knew who I was, and didn't speak? And now I am going away?" "Yes, that's unfortunate. I have hardly any other friend. I have indeed one very old friend here somewhere, but I don't quite like to call on him just yet. I wonder if you know anything of him, Mr. Phillotson? A parson somewhere about the country, I think he is." "No, I only know of one Mr. Phillotson. He lives a little way out in the country, at Lumsdon. He's a village schoolmaster." "Ah, I wonder if he's the same. Surely it is impossible. Only a schoolmaster still? Do you know his Christian name? Is it Richard?" "Yes, it is. I've directed books to him, though I've never seen him." "Then he couldn't do it." Jude's countenance fell, for how could he succeed in an enterprise wherein the great Phillotson had failed? He would have had a day of despair if the news had not arrived during his sweet Sue's presence. But even at this moment he had visions of how Phillotson's failure in the grand university scheme would depress him when she had gone. "As we are going to take a walk, suppose we go and call upon him," said Jude suddenly. "It is not late." She agreed, and they went along up a hill, and through some prettily wooded country. Presently the embattled tower and square turret of a church rose into the sky, and then the schoolhouse. They inquired of a person in the street if Mr. Phillotson was likely to be at home, and were informed that he was always at home. A knock brought him to the schoolhouse door, with a candle in his hand, and a look of inquiry on his face, which had grown thin and careworn since Jude last set eyes on him. That after all these years the meeting with Mr. Phillotson should be of this homely complexion, destroyed at one stroke the halo which had surrounded the schoolmaster's figure in Jude's imagination ever since their parting. It created in him at the same time a sympathy with Phillotson, as an obviously much chastened and disappointed man. Jude told him his name, and said he had come to see him as an old friend who had been kind to him in his youthful days. "I don't remember you in the least," said the schoolmaster thoughtfully. "You are one of my pupils, you say? Yes, no doubt. But they number so many thousand by this time of my life, and have naturally changed so much, that I remember very few except the quite recent ones." "It was out at Marygreen," said Jude, wishing he had not come. "Yes, I was there a short time. And is this an old pupil too?" "No, that's my cousin. I wrote to you for some grammars, if you recollect, and you sent them." "Ah, yes, I do dimly recall that incident." "It was very kind of you to do it, and it was you who first started me on that course. On the morning you left Marygreen, when your goods were on the waggon, you wished me good-bye, and said your scheme was to be a university man and enter the church, that a degree was the necessary hall-mark of one who wanted to do anything as a theologian or teacher. I remember I thought that privately, but I wonder I did not keep my own counsel. The idea was given up years ago. I have never forgotten it. It was that which brought me to this part of the country, and out here to see you to-night." "Come in," said Phillotson, "and your cousin too." They entered the parlour of the schoolhouse, where there was a lamp with a paper shade, which threw the light down on 3 or 4 books. Phillotson took it off so that they could see each other better, and the rays fell on the nervous little face and vivacious dark eyes and hair of Sue, on the earnest features of her cousin, and on the schoolmaster's own maturer face and figure, showing him to be a spare and thoughtful personage of 45, with a thin-lipped, somewhat refined mouth, a slightly stooping habit, and a black frock-coat, which, from continued frictions, shone a little at the shoulder-blades, the middle of the back, and the elbows. The old friendship was imperceptibly renewed, the schoolmaster speaking of his experiences, and the cousins of theirs. He told them that he still thought of the church sometimes, and that though he could not enter it as he had intended to do in former years, he might enter it as a licentiate. Meanwhile, he said, he was comfortable in his present position, though he was in want of a pupil-teacher. They did not stay to supper, Sue having to be indoors before it grew late, and the road was retraced to Christminster. Though they had talked of nothing more than general subjects, Jude was surprised to find what a revelation of woman his cousin was to him. She was so vibrant that everything she did seemed to have its source in feeling. An exciting thought would make her walk ahead so fast that he could hardly keep up with her, and her sensitiveness on some points was such that it might have been misread as vanity. It was with heart-sickness he perceived that while her sentiments towards him were those of the frankest friendliness only, he loved her more than before becoming acquainted with her, and the gloom of the walk home lay not in the night overhead, but in the thought of her departure. "Why must you leave Christminster?" he said regretfully. "How can you do otherwise than cling to a city in whose history such men as Newman, Pusey, Ward, Keble loom so large?" "Yes, they do. Though how large do they loom in the history of the world? What a funny reason for caring to stay! I should never have thought of it." She laughed. "Well, I must go," she continued. "Miss Fontover, one of the partners whom I serve, is offended with me, and I with her, and it is best I go." "How did that happen?" "She broke some statuary of mine." "Oh? Wilfully?" "Yes. She found it in my room, and though it was my property she threw it on the floor and stamped on it, because it was not according to her taste, and ground the arms and the head of one of the figures all to bits with her heel. A horrid thing! Too Catholic apostolic for her, I suppose. No doubt she called them popish images, and talked of the invocation of saints." "No, no, she didn't do that. She saw the matter quite differently." "Ah, then I am surprised." "Yes, it was for quite some other reason that she didn't like my patron saints. So I was led to retort upon her, and the end of it was that I resolved not to stay, but to get into an occupation in which I shall be more independent." "Why don't you try teaching again? You once did, I heard." "I never thought of resuming it, for I was getting on as an art designer. Do let me ask Mr. Phillotson to let you try a hand in his school. If you like it, and go to a training college, and become a first-class certified mistress, you get twice as large an income as any designer or church artist, and twice as much freedom." "Well, ask him. Now I must go in. Good-bye, dear Jude. I am so glad we have met at last. We needn't quarrel because our parents did, need we?" Jude did not like to let her see quite how much he agreed with her, and went his way to the remote street in which he had his lodging. To keep Sue Bridehead near him was now a desire which operated without regard of consequences, and the next evening he again set out for Lumsden, fearing to trust to the persuasive effects of a note only. The schoolmaster was unprepared for such a proposal. "What I rather wanted was a second year's transfer, as it is called," he said. "Of course your cousin would do, personally, but she has no experience." "Oh, she has she? Does she really think of adopting teaching as a profession?" Jude said she was disposed to do so, he thought, and his ingenious arguments on her natural fitness for assisting Mr. Phillotson, of which Jude knew nothing whatever, so influenced the schoolmaster that he said he would engage her, assuring Jude as a friend that unless his cousin really meant to follow on in the same course, and regard this step as the first stage of an apprenticeship, of which her training in a normal school would be the second stage, her time would be wasted quite, the salary being merely nominal. The day after this visit Phillotson received a letter from Jude, containing the information that he had again consulted his cousin, who took more and more warmly to the idea of tuition, and that she had agreed to come. It did not occur for a moment to the schoolmaster and recluse that Jude's ardour in promoting the arrangement arose from any other feelings towards Sue than the instinct of cooperation common among members of the same family. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The schoolmaster sat in his homely dwelling attached to the school, both being modern erections, and he looked across the way at the old house in which his teacher, Sue, had a lodging. The arrangement had been concluded very quickly. A pupil-teacher who was to have been transferred to Mr. Phillotson's school had failed him, and Sue had been taken as stopgap. All such professional arrangements as these could only last till the next annual visit of Her Majesty's inspector, whose approval was necessary to make them permanent. Having taught for some 2 years in London, though she had abandoned that vocation of late, Miss Bridehead was not exactly a novice, and Phillotson thought there would be no difficulty in retaining her services, which he already wished to do, though she had only been with him 3 or 4 weeks. He had found her quite as bright as Jude had described her, and what master tradesman does not wish to keep an apprentice who saves him half his labour? It was a little over 8:30 in the morning, and he was waiting to see her cross the road to the school, when he would follow. At 20 minutes to 9 she did cross, a light hat tossed on her head, and he watched her as a curiosity. A new emanation, which had nothing to do with her skill as a teacher, seemed to surround her this morning. He went to the school also, and Sue remained governing her class at the other end of the room all day under his eye. She certainly was an excellent teacher. It was part of his duty to give her private lessons in the evening, and some article in the code made it necessary that a respectable elderly woman should be present at these lessons, when the teacher and taught were of different sexes. Richard Phillotson thought of the absurdity of the regulation in this case, when he was old enough to be the girl's father, but he faithfully acted up to it, and sat down with her in a room where Mrs. Hawes, the widow at whose house Sue lodged, occupied herself with sewing. The regulation was indeed not easy to evade, for there was no other sitting-room in the dwelling. Sometimes, as she figured, it was arithmetic that they were working at, she would involuntarily glance up with a little inquiring smile at him, as if she assumed that, being the master, He must perceive all that was passing in her brain as right or wrong. Phillotson was not really thinking of the arithmetic at all, but of her, in a novel way which somehow seemed strange to him as preceptor. Perhaps she knew that he was thinking of her thus. For a few weeks their work had gone on with a monotony which in itself was a delight to him. Then it happened that the children were to be taken to Christminster to see an itinerant exhibition, in the shape of a model of Jerusalem, to which schools were admitted at a penny a head in the interests of education. They marched along the road two and two, she beside her class with her simple cotton sunshade, her little thumb cocked up against its stem, and Phillotson behind in his long dangling coat, handling his walking-stick genteelly in the musing mood which had come over him since her arrival. The afternoon was one of sun and dust, and when they entered the exhibition room few people were present but themselves. The model of the ancient city stood in the middle of the apartment, and the proprietor, with a fine religious philanthropy written on his features, walked round it with a pointer in his hand, showing the young people the various quarters and places known to them by name from reading their Bibles: Mount Moriah, the valley of Jehoshaphat, the city of Zion, the walls and the gates, outside one of which there was a large mound like a tumulus, and on the mound a little white cross. The spot, he said, was Calvary. "I think," said Sue to the schoolmaster, as she stood with him a little in the background, "that this model, elaborate as it is a very imaginary production. How does anybody know that Jerusalem was like this in the time of Christ? I'm sure this man doesn't." "It is made after the best conjectural maps, based on actual visits to the city as it now exists." "I fancy we have had enough of Jerusalem," she said, "considering we are not descended from the Jews." "There was nothing first-rate about the place or people after all, as there was about Athens, Rome, Alexandria, and other old cities." "But, my dear girl, consider what it is to us." She was silent, for she was easily repressed, and then perceived behind the group of children clustered round the model a young man in a white flannel jacket, his form being bent so low in his intent inspection of the valley of Jehoshaphat that his face was almost hidden from view by the Mount of Olives. "Look at your cousin Jude," continued the schoolmaster. "He doesn't think we have had enough of Jerusalem." "Ah, I didn't see him!" she cried in her quick light voice. "Jude, how seriously you are going into it!" Jude started up from his reverie and saw her. "Oh, Sue," he said, with a glad flush of embarrassment, "these are your school children, of course. I saw that schools were admitted in the afternoons, and thought you might come. But I got so deeply interested that I didn't remember where I was. How it carries one back, doesn't it? I could examine it for hours, but I have only a few minutes, unfortunately, for I am in the middle of a job out here." "Your cousin is so terribly clever that she criticizes it unmercifully," said Phillotson, with good-humoured satire. "She's quite sceptical as to its correctness." "No, Mr. Phillotson, I am not altogether. I hate to be what is called a clever girl. There are too many of that sort now," answered Sue sensitively. "I only meant—I don't know what I meant, except that it is what you don't understand." "I know your meaning," said Jude ardently, although he did not, "and I think you are quite right." "That's a good Jude. I know you believe in me." She impulsively seized his hand, and leaving a reproachful look on the schoolmaster, turned away to Jude, her voice revealing a tremor which she herself felt to be absurdly uncalled for by sarcasm so gentle. She had not the least conception how the hearts of the twain went out to her at this momentary revelation of feeling, and what a complication she was building up thereby in the futures of both. The model wore too much of an educational aspect for the children not to tire of it soon, and a little later in the afternoon they were all marched back to Lumsdon, Jude returning to his work. He watched the juvenile flock in their clean frocks and pinafores filing down the street towards the country beside Phillotson and Sue, and a sad, dissatisfied sense of being out of the scheme of the latter's lives had possession of him. Phillotson had invited him to walk out to see them on Friday evening, when there would be no lessons to give to Sue, and Jude had eagerly promised to avail himself of the opportunity. Meanwhile the scholars and teachers moved homewards, and the next day, on looking at the blackboard in Sue's class, Phillotson was surprised to find upon it, skilfully drawn in chalk, a perspective view of Jerusalem, with every building shown in its place. "I thought you took no interest in the model, and hardly looked at it," he said. "I hardly did," said she, "but I remember that much of it." "It is more than I remembered myself." Her Majesty's school inspector was at that time paying surprise visits in this neighbourhood to test the teaching unawares, and 2 days later, in the middle of the morning lessons, the latch of the door was softly lifted, and in walked my gentleman, the king of terrors to pupil-teachers. To Mr. Phillotson the surprise was not great. Like the lady in the story, he had been played that trick too many times to be unprepared. But Sue's class was at the further end of the room, and her back was towards the entrance. The inspector therefore came and stood behind her and watched her teaching some half-minute before she became aware of his presence. She turned, and realized that an oft-dreaded moment had come. The effect upon her timidity was such that she uttered a cry of fright. Phillotson, with a strange instinct of solicitude quite beyond his control, was at her side just in time to prevent her falling from faintness. She soon recovered herself and laughed, but when the inspector had gone there was a reaction, and she was so white that Phillotson took her into his room and gave her some brandy to bring her round. She found him holding her hand. "You ought to have told me," she gasped petulantly, "that one of the inspector's surprise visits was imminent. Oh, what shall I do? Now he'll write and tell the managers that I am no good, and I shall be disgraced for ever." "He won't do that, my dear little girl. You were the best teacher I ever had." He looked so gently at her that she was moved, and regretted that she had upbraided him. When she was better she went home. Jude in the meantime had been waiting impatiently for Friday. On both Wednesday and Thursday he had been so much under the influence of his desire to see her that he walked after dark some distance along the road in the direction of the village, and on returning to his room to read, found himself quite unable to concentrate his mind on the page. On Friday, as soon as he had got himself up as he thought Sue would like to see him, and made a hasty tea, he set out, notwithstanding that the evening was wet. The trees overhead deepened the gloom of the hour, and they dripped sadly upon him, impressing him with forebodings, illogical forebodings, for though he knew that he loved her, he also knew that he could not be more to her than he was. On turning the corner and entering the village, the first sight that greeted his eyes was that of two figures under one umbrella coming out of the vicarage gate. He was too far back for them to notice him, but he knew in a moment that they were Sue and Phillotson. The latter was holding the umbrella over her head, and they had evidently been paying a visit to the vicar, probably on some business connected with the school work. And as they walked along the wet and deserted lane, Jude saw Phillotson place his arm round the girl's waist, whereupon she gently removed it, but he replaced it, and she let it remain, looking quickly round her with an air of misgiving. She did not look absolutely behind her, and therefore did not see Jude, who sank into the hedge like one struck with a blight. There he remained hidden till they had reached Sue's cottage, and she had passed in, Phillotson going on to the school hard by. "Oh, he's too old for her, too old!" cried Jude in all the terrible sickness of hopeless handicapped love. He could not interfere. Was he not Arabella's? He was unable to go on further, and retraced his steps towards Christminster. Every tread of his feet seemed to say to him that he must on no account stand in the schoolmaster's way with Sue. Phillotson was perhaps 20 years her senior, but many a happy marriage had been made in such conditions of age. The ironical clinch to his sorrow was given by the thought that the intimacy between his cousin and the schoolmaster had been brought about entirely by himself. End of chapter 5. Part the second, chapter 6, of Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Jude's old and embittered aunt lay unwell at Marygreen, and on the following Sunday he went to see her, a visit which was the result of a victorious struggle against his inclination to turn aside to the village of Lumsden and obtain a miserable interview with his cousin, in which the word nearest his heart could not be spoken, and the sight which had tortured him could not be revealed. His aunt was now unable to leave her bed, and a great part of Jude's short stay was occupied in making arrangements for her comfort. The little bakery business had been sold to a neighbour, and with the proceeds of this and her savings she was comfortably supplied with necessaries and more, a widow of the same village living with her and ministering to her wants. It was not till the time had nearly come for him to leave that he obtained a quiet talk with her, and his words tended insensibly towards his cousin. "Was Sue born here?" "She was, in this room. They were living here at the time. What made 'ee ask that?" "Oh, I wanted to know." "Now you've been seeing her," said the harsh old woman. "And what did I tell 'ee?" "Well, that I was not to see her." "Have you gossiped with her?" "Yes." "Then don't keep it up. She was brought up by her father to hate her mother's family, and she look with no favour upon a working chap like you, a townish girl as she's become by now. I never cared much about her. A pert little thing, that's what she was too often, with her tight strained nerves. Many's the time I've smacked her for her impertinence. Why, one day when she was walking into the pond with her shoes and stockings off, and her petticoats pulled above her knees, afore I could cry out for shame, she said, 'Move on, auntie, this is no sight for modest eyes.' She was a little child then. She was 12 if a day. Well, of course, but now she's older she's of a thoughtful, quivering, tender nature, and as sensitive as—" "Jude!" cried his aunt, springing up in bed. "Don't you be a fool about her!" "No, no, of course not. Your marrying that woman Arabella was about as bad a thing as a man could possibly do for himself by trying hard. But she's gone to the other side of the world, and mid never trouble you again. And there'd be a worse thing if you, tied and bound as you be, should have a fancy for Sue. If your cousin is civil to you, take her civility for what it's worth. But anything more than a relation's good wishes, it is stark madness for 'ee to give her. If she's townish and wanton, it mid bring 'ee to ruin. Don't say anything against her, aunt. Don't, please." A relief was afforded to him by the entry of the companion and nurse of his aunt, who must have been listening to the conversation, for she began a commentary on past years, introducing Sue Bridehead as a character in her recollections. She described what an odd little maid Sue had been when a pupil at the village school across the green opposite, before her father went to London; how, when the vicar arranged readings and recitations, she appeared on the platform, the smallest of them all, in her little white frock and shoes and pink sash; how she recited Excelsior, There was a sound of revelry by night, and the Raven; how during the delivery she would knit her little brows and glare round tragically, and say to the empty air, as if some real creature stood there, "Ghastly, grim, and ancient Raven, wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." "She'd bring up the nasty carrion bird that clear," corroborated the sick woman reluctantly, "as she stood there in her little sash and things, that ye could see un almost afore your very eyes. You too, Jude, had the same trick as a child of seeming to see things in the air." The neighbour told also of Sue's accomplishments in other kinds. "She was not exactly a tomboy, you know, but she would do things that only boys would do, as a rule. I've seen her hit in and steer down the long slide on yonder pond, with her little curls blowing, one of a file of 20 moving along against the sky, like shapes painted on glass, and up the backslide without stopping. All boys except herself, and then they'd cheer her, and then she'd say, 'Don't be saucy, boys,' and suddenly run indoors. They'd try to coax her out again, but it wouldn't come." These retrospective visions of Sue only made Jude the more miserable that he was unable to woo her, and he left the cottage of his aunt that day with a heavy heart. He would fain have glanced into the school to see the room in which Sue's little figure had so glorified itself, but he checked his desire and went on. It being Sunday evening, some villagers who had known him during his residence here were standing in a group in their best clothes. Jude was startled by a salute from one of them. "You got there right enough, then?" Jude showed that he did not understand. "Why, to the seat of learning, the city of light you used to talk to us about as a little boy. Is it all you expected of it?" "Yes, more," cried Jude. "When I was there once for an hour I didn't see much in it for my part. Out crumbling buildings, half church, half almshouse, and not much going on at that." "You are wrong, John. There is more going on than meets the eye of a man walking through the streets. It's a unique centre of thought and religion, the intellectual and spiritual granary of this country. All that silence and absence of goings on is the stillness of infinite motion. The sleep of the spinning top, to borrow the simile of a well-known writer." "Oh, well, it med be all that, or it med not. As I say, I didn't see nothing of it the hour or two I was there. So I went in and had a pot of beer, and a penny loaf, and a ha'porth of cheese, and waited till it was time to come along home. You've joined the college by this time, I suppose?" "Ah, no," said Jude. "I'm almost as far off that as ever." "How so?" Jude slapped his pocket. "Just what we thought. Such places be not for such as you, only for them with plenty of money." "There you are wrong," said Jude with some bitterness. "They are for such ones." Still, the remark was sufficient to withdraw Jude's attention from the imaginative world he had lately inhabited, in which an abstract figure, more or less himself, was steeping his mind in a sublimation of the arts and sciences, and making his calling and election sure to a seat in the paradise of the learned. He was set regarding his prospects in a cold northern light. He had lately felt that he could not quite satisfy himself in his Greek, in the Greek of the dramatists particularly. So fatigued was he sometimes after his day's work that he could not maintain the critical attention necessary for thorough application. He felt that he wanted a coach, a friend at his elbow to tell him in a moment what sometimes would occupy him a weary month in extracting from unanticipative, clumsy books. It was decidedly necessary to consider facts a little more closely than he had done of late. What was the good, after all, of using up his spare hours in a vague labour called private study, without giving an outlook on practicabilities? "I ought to have thought of this before," he said as he journeyed back. "It would have been better never to have embarked in the scheme at all, than to do it without seeing clearly where I am going, or what I am aiming at. This hovering outside the walls of the colleges, as if expecting some arm to be stretched out from them to lift me inside, won't do. I must get special information." Next week, accordingly, he sought it. What at first seemed an opportunity occurred one afternoon when he saw an elderly gentleman, who had been pointed out as the head of a particular college, walking in the public path of a park-like enclosure near the spot at which Jude chanced to be sitting. The gentleman came nearer, and Jude looked anxiously at his face. It seemed benign, considerate, yet rather reserved. On second thoughts Jude felt that he could not go up and address him, but he was sufficiently influenced by the incident to think what a wise thing it would be for him to state his difficulties by letter to some of the best and most judicious of these old masters, and obtain their advice. During the next week or two he accordingly placed himself in such positions about the city as would afford him glimpses of several of the most distinguished among the provosts, wardens, and other heads of houses, and from those he ultimately selected 5 whose physiognomies seemed to say to him that they were appreciative and far-seeing men. To these 5 he addressed letters, briefly stating his difficulties, and asking their opinion on his stranded situation. When the letters were posted, Jude mentally began to criticize them. He wished they had not been sent. "It is just one of those intrusive, vulgar, pushing applications which are so common in these days," he thought. "Why couldn't I know better than address other strangers in such a way? I may be an impostor, an idle scamp, a man with a bad character, for all they know to the contrary. Perhaps that's what I am." Nevertheless, he found himself clinging to the hope of some reply as to his one last chance of redemption. He waited day after day, saying that it was perfectly absurd to expect, yet expecting. While he waited he was suddenly stirred by news about Phillotson. Phillotson was giving up the school near Christminster for a larger one further south, in Mid-Wessex. What this meant, how it would affect his cousin, whether, as seemed possible, it was a practical move of the schoolmasters towards a larger income, in view of a provision for 2 instead of 1, he would not allow himself to say. And the tender relations between Phillotson and the young girl of whom Jude was passionately enamoured effectually made it repugnant to Jude's tastes to apply to Phillotson for advice on his own scheme. Meanwhile the academic dignitaries to whom Jude had written vouchsafed no answer, and the young man was thus thrown back entirely on himself, as formerly, with the added gloom of a weakened hope. By indirect inquiries he soon perceived clearly what he had long uneasily suspected, that to qualify himself for certain open scholarships and exhibitions was the only brilliant course. But to do this a good deal of coaching would be necessary, and much natural ability. It was next to impossible that a man reading on his own system, however widely and thoroughly, even over the prolonged period of 10 years, should be able to compete with those who had passed their lives under trained teachers and had worked to ordained lines. The other course, that of buying himself in, so to speak, seemed the only one really open to men like him, the difficulty being simply of the material kind. With the help of his information he began to reckon the extent of this material obstacle, and ascertained to his dismay that, at the rate at which, with the best of fortune, he would be able to save money, 15 years must elapse before he could be in a position to forward testimonials to the head of a college and advance to a matriculation examination. The undertaking was hopeless. He saw what a curious and cunning glamour the neighbourhood of the place had exercised over him. To get there and live there, to move among the churches and halls and become imbued with the genius loci, had seemed to his dreaming youth, as the spot shaped its charms to him from its halo on the horizon, the obvious and ideal thing to do. "Let me only get there," he had said with the fatuousness of Crusoe over his big boat, "and the rest is but a matter of time and energy." It would have been far better for him in every way if he had never come within sight and sound of the delusive precincts, had gone to some busy commercial town with the sole object of making money by his wits, and thence surveyed his plan in true perspective. Well, all that was clear to him amounted to this, that the whole scheme had burst up like an iridescent soap bubble under the touch of a reasoned inquiry. He looked back at himself along the vista of his past years, and his thought was akin to Heine's. Above the youth's inspired and flashing eyes I see the motley mocking fool's cap rise. Fortunately he had not been allowed to bring his disappointment into his dear Sue's life by involving her in his collapse, and the painful details of his awakening to a sense of his limitations should now be spared her as far as possible. After all, she had only known a little part of the miserable struggle in which he had been engaged, thus unequipped, poor, and unforeseeing. He always remembered the appearance of the afternoon on which he awoke from his dream. Not quite knowing what to do with himself, he went up to an octagonal chamber in the lantern of a singularly built theatre that was set amidst this quaint and singular city. It had windows all round, from which an outlook over the whole town and its edifices could be gained. Jude's eyes swept all the views in succession, meditatively, mournfully, yet sturdily. Those buildings and their associations and privileges were not for him. From the looming roof of the great library, into which he hardly ever had time to enter, his gaze travelled on to the varied spires, halls, gables, streets, chapels, gardens, quadrangles, which composed the ensemble of this unrivalled panorama. He saw that his destiny lay not with these, but among the manual toilers in the shabby purlieu which he himself occupied, unrecognized as part of the city at all by its visitors and panegyrists, yet without whose denizens the hard readers could not read, nor the high thinkers live. He looked over the town into the country beyond, to the trees which screened her whose presence had at first been the support of his heart, and whose loss was now a maddening torture. But for this blow he might have borne with his fate. With Sue as companion he could have renounced his ambitions with a smile. Without her it was inevitable that the reaction from the long strain to which he had subjected himself should affect him disastrously. Phillotson had no doubt passed through a similar intellectual disappointment to that which now enveloped him, but the schoolmaster had been since blessed with the consolation of sweet Sue, while for him there was no consoler. Descending to the streets he went listlessly along till he arrived at an inn, and entered it. Here he drank several glasses of beer in rapid succession, and when he came out it was night. By the light of the flickering lamps he rambled home to supper, and had not long been sitting at a table when his landlady brought up a letter that had just arrived for him. She laid it down, as if impressed with a sense of its possible importance, and on looking at it Jude perceived that it bore the embossed stamp of one of the colleges whose heads he had addressed. "One, at last!" cried Jude. The communication was brief, and not exactly what he had expected, though it really was from the master in person. It ran thus: Bibliol College. Sir, I have read your letter with interest, and, judging from your description of yourself as a working man, I venture to think that you will have a much better chance of success in life by remaining in your own sphere and sticking to your trade than by adopting any other course. That, therefore, is what I advise you to do. Yours faithfully, T. Tettaphany. To Mr. J. Fawley, stonemason. This terribly sensible advice exasperated Jude. He had known all that before. He knew it was true. Yet it seemed a hard slap after 10 years of labour, and its effect upon him just now was to make him rise recklessly from the table, and, instead of reading as usual, to go downstairs and into the street. He stood at a bar and tossed off 2 or 3 glasses, then unconsciously sauntered along till he came to a spot called the Four Ways, in the middle of the city, gazing abstractedly at the groups of people like one in a trance, till, coming to himself, he began talking to the policeman fixed there. The officer yawned, stretched out his elbows, elevated himself an inch and a half on the balls of his toes, smiled, and, looking humorously at Jude, said, "You've had a wet, young man." "No, I've only begun," he replied cynically. Whatever his wetness, his brains were dry enough. He only heard in part the policeman's further remarks, having fallen into thought on what struggling people like himself had stood at that crossway, whom nobody ever thought of now. It had more history than the oldest college in the city. It was literally teeming, stratified with the shades of human groups, who had met there for tragedy, comedy, farce, real enactments of the intensest kind. At Fourways men had stood and talked of Napoleon, the loss of America, the execution of King Charles, the burning of the martyrs, the Crusades, the Norman Conquest, possibly the arrival of Caesar. Here the two sexes had met for loving, hating, coupling, parting, had waited, had suffered for each other, had triumphed over each other, cursed each other in jealousy, blessed each other in forgiveness. He began to see that the town life was a book of humanity infinitely more palpitating, varied, and compendious than the gown life. Those struggling men and women before him were the reality of Christminster, though they knew little of Christ or Minster. That was one of the humorous things. The floating population of students and teachers, who did know both in a way, were not Christminster in a local sense at all. He looked at his watch, and, in pursuit of this idea, he went on till he came to a public hall, where a promenade concert was in progress. Jude entered, and found the room full of shop youths and girls, soldiers, apprentices, boys of 11 smoking cigarettes, and light women of the more respectable and amateur class. He had tapped the real Christminster life. A band was playing, and the crowd walked about and jostled each other, and every now and then a man got up on a platform and sang a comic song. The spirit of Sue seemed to hover round him, and prevent his flirting and drinking with the frolicsome girls, who made advances, wistful to gain a little joy. At 10 o'clock he came away, choosing a circuitous route homeward to pass the gates of the college whose head had just sent him the note. The gates were shut, and by an impulse he took from his pocket the lump of chalk which, as a workman, he usually carried there, and wrote along the wall, "I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Yea, who knoweth not such things as these?" Job 12:3. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The stroke of scorn relieved his mind, and the next morning he laughed at his self-conceit. But the laugh was not a healthy one. He reread the letter from the master, and the wisdom of its lines, which had at first exasperated him, chilled and depressed him now. He saw himself as a fool indeed. Deprived of the objects of both intellect and emotion, he could not proceed to his work. Whenever he felt reconciled to his fate as a student, there came to disturb his calm his hopeless relations with Sue. That the one affined soul he had ever met was lost to him through his marriage returned upon him with cruel persistency, till, unable to bear it longer, he again rushed for distraction to the real Christminster life. He now sought it out in an obscure and low-ceiled tavern up a court which was well known to certain worthies of the place, and in brighter times would have interested him simply by its quaintness. Here he sat, more or less all the day, convinced that he was at bottom a vicious character, of whom it was hopeless to expect anything. In the evening the frequenters of the house dropped in one by one, Jude still retaining his seat in the corner, though his money was all spent, and he had not eaten anything the whole day except a biscuit. He surveyed his gathering companions with all the equanimity and philosophy of a man who has been drinking long and slowly, and made friends with several, to wit, Tinker Tailor, a decayed church ironmonger who appeared to have been of a religious turn in earlier years, but was somewhat blasphemous now; also a red-nosed auctioneer; also two Gothic masons like himself, called Uncle Jim and Uncle Joe. There were present too some clerks and a gown and surplice maker's assistant, two ladies who sported moral characters of various depths of shade, according to their company, nicknamed Bower of Bliss and Freckles, some horsey men in the know of betting circles, a travelling actor from the theatre, and two devil-may-care young men who proved to be gownless undergraduates. They had slipped in by stealth to meet a man about bull-pups, and stayed to drink and smoke short pipes with the racing gents aforesaid, looking at their watches every now and then. The conversation waxed general. Christminster society was criticized, the dons, magistrates, and other people in authority being sincerely pitied for their shortcomings, while opinions on how they ought to conduct themselves and their affairs to be properly respected were exchanged in a large-minded and disinterested manner. Jude Fawley, with the self-conceit, effrontery, and aplomb of a strong-brained fellow in liquor, threw in his remarks somewhat peremptorily, and his aims having been what they were for so many years, everything the other said turned upon his tongue by a sort of mechanical craze to the subject of scholarship and study, the extent of his own learning being dwelt upon with an insistence that would have appeared pitiable to himself in his sane hours. "I don't care a damn," he was saying, "for any provost, warden, principal, fellow, or cursed master of arts in the university. What I know is that I'd lick 'em on their own ground if they'd give me a chance, and show 'em a few things they're not up to yet." "Hear, hear," said the undergraduates from the corner, where they were talking privately about the pups. "You always was fond of books, I've heard," said Tinker Tailor, "and I don't doubt what you state. Now with me 'twas different. I always thought there was more to be learnt outside a book than in, and I took my steps accordingly, or I shouldn't have been the man I am." "You aim at the church, I believe," said Uncle Joe. "If you are such a scholar as to pitch your hopes so high as that, why not give us a specimen of your scholarship? Can't say the creed in Latin, man. That was how they once put it to a chap down in my country." "I should think so," said Jude haughtily. "Not he! Like his conceit!" screamed one of the ladies. "Just you shut up, Bower of Bliss," said one of the undergraduates. "Silence!" He drank off the spirits in his tumbler, rapped with it on the counter, and announced, "The gentleman in the corner is going to rehearse the articles of his belief in the Latin tongue for the edification of the company." "I won't," said Jude. "Yes, have a try," said the surplice maker. "You can't," said Uncle Joe. "Yes, he can," said Tinker Tailor. "I'll swear I can," said Jude. "Well, come now, stand me a small Scotch cold, and I'll do it straight off." "That's a fair offer," said the undergraduate, throwing down the money for the whisky. The barmaid concocted the mixture with the bearing of a person compelled to live amongst animals of an inferior species, and the glass was handed across to Jude, who, having drunk the contents, stood up and began rhetorically, without hesitation: "Credo in unum Deum, Patrem omnipotentem, factorem coli et terrae, visibilium omnium et invisibilium." "Good! Excellent Latin!" cried one of the undergraduates, who, however, had not the slightest conception of a single word. A silence reigned among the rest in the bar, and the maids stood still, Jude's voice echoing sonorously into the inner parlour, where the landlord was dozing, and bringing him out to see what was going on. Jude had declaimed steadily ahead, and was continuing: "Crucifixus etiam pro nobis, sub Pontio Pilato passus, et sepultus est. et resurrexit tertia die, secundum scripturas." "That's the Nicene," sneered the second undergraduate, "and we wanted the Apostles." "You didn't say so, and every fool knows, except you, that the Nicene is the most historic creed." "Let un go on, let un go on," said the auctioneer. But Jude's mind seemed to grow confused soon, and he could not get on. He put his hand to his forehead, and his face assumed an expression of pain. "Give him another glass, then he'll fetch up and get through it," said Tinker Tailor. Somebody threw down threepence. The glass was handed. Jude stretched out his arm for it without looking, and having swallowed the liquor went on in a moment in a revived voice, raising it as he neared the end with the manner of a priest leading a congregation. "Et in spiritum sanctum dominum et vivificantum, qui ex patre filique procedit, qui cum patre et filio simul adorator et conglorificator, qui locus est per prophetas, et unum catholicum et apostolicum ecclesiam, confiteor unum baptisma in remissionem peccatorum, et expecto resurrectionem mortorum, et vitam venturae seculi. Amen." "Well done," said several, enjoying the last word, as being the first and only one they had recognized. Then Jude seemed to shake the fumes from his brain, as he stared round upon them. "You pack of fools!" he cried. "Which one of you knows whether I have said it or no? It might have been the rat-catcher's daughter in double Dutch for all that your besotted heads can tell. See what I have brought myself to, the crew I have come among." The landlord, who had already had his licence endorsed for harbouring queer characters, feared a riot, and came outside the counter. But Jude, in his sudden flash of reason, had turned in disgust and left the scene, the door slamming with a dull thud behind him. He hastened down the lane and round into the straight broad street, which he followed till it merged in the highway, and all sound of his late companions had been left behind. Onward he still went, under the influence of a childlike yearning for the one being in the world to whom it seemed possible to fly, an unreasoning desire, whose ill judgment was not apparent to him now. In the course of an hour, when it was between 10 and 11 o'clock, he entered the village of Lumsdon, and reaching the cottage saw that a light was burning in a downstairs room, which he assumed, rightly as it happened, to be hers. Jude stepped close to the wall and tapped with his finger on the pane, saying impatiently, "Sue! Sue!" She must have recognized his voice, for the light disappeared from the apartment, and in a second or two the door was unlocked and opened, and Sue appeared with a candle in her hand. "Is it Jude?" "Yes, it is. My dear, dear cousin, what is the matter?" "Oh, I couldn't help coming, Sue," said he, sinking down upon the doorstep. "I am so wicked, Sue. My heart is nearly broken, and I could not bear my life as it was. So I have been drinking and blaspheming, or next door to it, and saying holy things in disreputable quarters, repeating in idle bravado words which ought never to be uttered but reverently. Oh, do anything with me, Sue. Kill me, I don't care. Only don't hate me and despise me like all the rest of the world. You are ill, poor dear. No, I won't despise you. Of course I won't. Come in and rest, and let me see what I can do for you. Now, lean on me and don't mind." With one hand holding the candle, and the other supporting him, she led him indoors, and placed him in the only easy chair the meagrely furnished house afforded, stretching his feet upon another, and pulling off his boots. Jude, now getting towards his sober senses, could only say, "Dear, dear Sue," in a voice broken by grief and contrition. She asked him if he wanted anything to eat, but he shook his head. Then, telling him to go to sleep, and that she would come down early in the morning and get him some breakfast, she bade him good night and ascended the stairs. Almost immediately he fell into a heavy slumber, and did not wake till dawn. At first he did not know where he was, but by degrees his situation cleared to him, and he beheld it in all the ghastliness of a right mind. She knew the worst of him, the very worst. How could he face her now? She would soon be coming down to see about breakfast, as she had said, and there would he be in all his shame, confronting her. He could not bear the thought, and softly drawing on his boots, and taking his hat from the nail on which he had hung it, he slipped noiselessly out of the house. His fixed idea was to get away to some obscure spot and hide, and perhaps pray, and the only spot which occurred to him was Marygreen. He called at his lodgings in Christminster, where he found awaiting him a note of dismissal from his employer, and having packed up, he turned his back upon the city that had been such a thorn in his side, and struck southward into Wessex. He had no money left in his pockets, his small savings, deposited at one of the banks in Christminster, having fortunately been left untouched. To get to Marygreen, therefore, his only course was walking, and the distance being nearly 20 miles, he had ample time to complete on the way the sobering process begun in him. At some hour of the evening he reached Alfredston. Here he pawned his waistcoat, and having got out of the town a mile or two, slept under a rick that night. At dawn he rose, shook off the hayseeds and stems from his clothes, and started again, breasting the long white road up the hill to the downs, which had been visible to him a long way off, and passing the milestone at the top, whereon he had carved his hopes years ago. He reached the ancient hamlet while the people were at breakfast. Weary and mud-bespattered, but quite possessed of his ordinary clearness of brain, he sat down by the well, thinking as he did so what a poor Christ he made. Seeing a trough of water near, he bathed his face, and went on to the cottage of his great-aunt, whom he found breakfasting in bed, attended by the woman who lived with her. "What, out of work?" asked his relative, regarding him through eyes sunken deep under lids heavy as pot-covers, no other cause for his tumbled appearance suggesting itself to one whose whole life had been a struggle with material things. "Yes," said Jude heavily. "I think I must have a little rest." Refreshed by some breakfast, he went up to his old room and lay down in his shirt-sleeves after the manner of the artisan. He fell asleep for a short while, and when he awoke it was as if he had awakened in hell. It was hell, the hell of conscious failure, both in ambition and in love. He thought of that previous abyss into which he had fallen before leaving this part of the country, the deepest deep he had supposed it then. But it was not so deep as this. That had been the breaking in of the outer bulwarks of his hope. This was of his second line. If he had been a woman he must have screamed under the nervous tension which he was now undergoing. But that relief being denied to his virility, he clenched his teeth in misery, bringing lines about his mouth like those in the Laocoon, and corrugations between his brows. A mournful wind blew through the trees, and sounded in the chimney like the pedal notes of an organ. Each ivy leaf overgrowing the wall of the churchless churchyard hard by, now abandoned, pecked its neighbour smartly, and the vane on the new Victorian Gothic church in the new spot had already begun to creak. Yet apparently it was not always the outdoor wind that made the deep murmurs. It was a voice. He guessed its origin in a moment or two. The curate was praying with his aunt in the adjoining room. He remembered her speaking of him. Presently the sound ceased, and a step seemed to cross the landing. Jude sat up and shouted, "Ahoy!" The step made for his door, which was open, and a man looked in. It was a young clergyman. "I think you are Mr. Highridge," said Jude. "My aunt has mentioned you more than once. Well, here I am, just come home, a fellow gone to the bad, though I had the best intentions in the world at one time. Now I am melancholy mad, what with drinking and one thing and another." Slowly Jude unfolded to the curate his late plans and movements, by an unconscious bias dwelling less upon the intellectual and ambitious side of his dream, and more upon the theological, though this had, up till now, been merely a portion of the general plan of advancement. "Now, I know I have been a fool, and that folly is with me," added Jude in conclusion, "and I don't regret the collapse of my university hopes one jot. I wouldn't begin again if I were sure to succeed. I don't care for social success any more at all. But I do feel I should like to do some good thing, and I bitterly regret the church and the loss of my chance of being her ordained minister." The curate, who was a new man to this neighbourhood, had grown deeply interested, and at last he said, "If you feel a real call to the ministry, and I won't say from your conversation that you do not, for it is that of a thoughtful and educated man, you might enter the church as a licentiate. Only you must make up your mind to avoid strong drink." "I could avoid that easily enough, if I had any kind of hope to support me." End of chapter 7. Chapter 1 of Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At Melchester. For there was no other girl, O bridegroom, like her. Sappho. H.T. Wharton. It was a new idea, the ecclesiastical and altruistic life, as distinct from the intellectual and emulative life. A man could preach and do good to his fellow creatures without taking double firsts in the schools of Christminster, or having anything but ordinary knowledge. The old fancy which had led on to the culminating vision of the bishopric had not been an ethical or theological enthusiasm at all, but a mundane ambition masquerading in a surplice. He feared that his whole scheme had degenerated to, even though it might not have originated in, a social unrest which had no foundation in the nobler instincts, which was purely an artificial product of civilization. There were thousands of young men on the same self-seeking track at the present moment. The sensual hind who ate, drank, and lived carelessly with his wife through the days of his vanity was a more likeable being than he. But to enter the church in such an unscholarly way that he could not, in any probability, rise to a higher grade through all his career than that of the humble curate, wearing his life out in an obscure village or city slum, that might have a touch of goodness and greatness in it. That might be true religion, and a purgatorial course worthy of being followed by a remorseful man. The favourable light in which this new thought showed itself by contrast with his foregone intentions cheered Jude as he sat there, shabby and lonely, and it may be said to have given, during the next few days, the coup de grace to his intellectual career, a career which had extended over the greater part of a dozen years. He did nothing, however, for some long stagnant time to advance his new desire, occupying himself with little local jobs in putting up and lettering headstones about the neighbouring villages, and submitting to be regarded as a social failure, a returned purchase, by the half-dozen or so of farmers and other country people who condescended to nod to him. The human interest of the new intention, and a human interest is indispensable to the most spiritual and self-sacrificing, was created by a letter from Sue, bearing a fresh postmark. She evidently wrote with anxiety, and told very little about her own doings more than that she had passed some sort of examination for a Queen's scholarship, and was going to enter a training college at Melchester to complete herself for the vocation she had chosen, partly by his influence. There was a theological college at Melchester. Melchester was a quiet and soothing place, almost entirely ecclesiastical in its tone, a spot where worldly learning and intellectual smartness had no establishment, where the altruistic feelings that he did possess would perhaps be more highly estimated than a brilliancy which he did not. As it would be necessary that he should continue for a time to work at his trade while reading up divinity, which he had neglected at Christminster for the ordinary classical grind, what better course for him than to get employment at the further city, and pursue his plan of reading? That his excessive human interest in the new place was entirely of Sue's making, while at the same time Sue was to be regarded even less than formerly as proper to create it, had an ethical contradictoriness to which he was not blind. But that much he conceded to human frailty, and hoped to learn to love her only as a friend and kinswoman. He considered that he might so mark out his coming years as to begin his ministry at the age of 30, an age which much attracted him as being that of his exemplar when he first began to teach in Galilee. This would allow him plenty of time for deliberate study, and for acquiring capital by his trade to help his after course of keeping the necessary terms at a theological college. Christmas had come and passed, and Sue had gone to the Melchester Normal School. The time was just the worst in the year for Jude to get into new employment, and he had written suggesting to her that he should postpone his arrival for a month or so, till the days had lengthened. She had acquiesced so readily that he wished he had not proposed it. She evidently did not much care about him, though she had never once reproached him for his strange conduct in coming to her that night, and his silent disappearance. Neither had she ever said a word about her relations with Mr. Phillotson. Suddenly, however, quite a passionate letter arrived from Sue. She was quite lonely and miserable, she told him. She hated the place she was in. It was worse than the ecclesiastical designers. Worse than anywhere. She felt utterly friendless. Could he come immediately? Though when he did come she would only be able to see him at limited times, the rules of the establishment she found herself in being strict to a degree. It was Mr. Phillotson who had advised her to come there, and she wished she had never listened to him. Phillotson's suit was not exactly prospering, evidently, and Jude felt unreasonably glad. He packed up his things and went to Melchester with a lighter heart than he had known for months. This being the turning over of a new leaf, he duly looked about for a temperance hotel, and found a little establishment of that description in the street leading from the station. When he had had something to eat, he walked out into the dull winter light over the town bridge, and turned the corner towards the close. The day was foggy, and standing under the walls of the most graceful architectural pile in England, he paused and looked up. The lofty building was visible as far as the roof ridge. Above, the dwindling spire rose more and more remotely, till its apex was quite lost in the mist drifting across it. The lamps now began to be lighted, and turning to the west front he walked round. He took it as a good omen that numerous blocks of stone were lying about, which signified that the cathedral was undergoing restoration or repair to a considerable extent. It seemed to him, full of the superstitions of his beliefs, that this was an exercise of forethought on the part of a ruling power, that he might find plenty to do in the art he practised while waiting for a call to higher labours. Then a wave of warmth came over him, as he thought how near he now stood to the bright-eyed, vivacious girl with the broad forehead and pile of dark hair above it, the girl with the kindling glance, daringly soft at times, something like that of the girls he had seen in engravings from paintings of the Spanish school. She was here, actually in this close, in one of the houses confronting this very west façade. He went down the broad gravel path towards the building. It was an ancient edifice of the 15th century, once a palace, now a training school, with mullioned and transomed windows, and a courtyard in front shut in from the road by a wall. Jude opened the gate and went up to the door through which, on inquiring for his cousin, he was gingerly admitted to a waiting-room, and in a few minutes she came. Though she had been here such a short while, she was not as he had seen her last. All her bounding manner was gone. Her curves of motion had become subdued lines. The screens and subtleties of convention had likewise disappeared. Yet neither was she quite the woman who had written the letter that summoned him. That had plainly been dashed off in an impulse which second thoughts had somewhat regretted, thoughts that were possibly of his recent self-disgrace. Jude was quite overcome with emotion. "You don't think me a demoralized wretch for coming to you as I was, and going so shamefully, Sue?" "Oh, I have tried not to. You said enough to let me know what had caused it. I hope I shall never have any doubt of your worthiness, my poor Jude, and I am glad you have come." She wore a murrey-coloured gown with a little lace collar. It was made quite plain, and hung about her slight figure with clinging gracefulness. Her hair, which formerly she had worn according to the custom of the day, was now twisted up tightly, and she had altogether the air of a woman clipped and pruned by severe discipline, an under-brightness shining through from the depths which that discipline had not yet been able to reach. She had come forward prettily, but Jude felt that she had hardly expected him to kiss her, as he was burning to do, under other colours than those of cousinship. He could not perceive the least sign that Sue regarded him as a lover, or ever would do so, now that she knew the worst of him, even if he had the right to behave as one. And this helped on his growing resolve to tell her of his matrimonial entanglement, which he had put off doing from time to time in sheer dread of losing the bliss of her company. Sue came out into the town with him, and they walked and talked with tongues centred only on the passing moments. Jude said he would like to buy her a little present of some sort, and then she confessed with something of shame that she was dreadfully hungry. They were kept on very short allowances in the college, and a dinner, tea, and supper all in one was the present she most desired in the world. Jude thereupon took her to an inn, and ordered whatever the house afforded, which was not much. The place, however, gave them a delightful opportunity for a tête-à-tête, nobody else being in the room, and they talked freely. She told him about the school as it was at that date, and the rough living, and the mixed character of her fellow students, gathered together from all parts of the diocese, and how she had to get up and work by gas-light in the early morning, with all the bitterness of a young person to whom restraint was new. To all this he listened, but it was not what he wanted especially to know, her relations with Phillotson. That was what she did not tell. When they had sat and eaten, Jude impulsively placed his hand upon hers. She looked up and smiled, and took his quite freely into her own little soft one, dividing his fingers and coolly examining them, as if they were the fingers of a glove she was purchasing. "Your hands are rather rough, Jude, aren't they?" she said. "Yes. So would yours be if they held a mallet and chisel all day." "I don't dislike it, you know. I think it is noble to see a man's hands subdued to what he works in. Well, I'm rather glad I came to this training school after all. See how independent I shall be after 2 years' training. I shall pass pretty high, I expect, and Mr. Phillotson will use his influence to get me a big school." She had touched the subject at last. "I had a suspicion, a fear," said Jude, "that he cared about you rather warmly, and perhaps wanted to marry you." "Now don't be such a silly boy." "He has said something about it, I expect." "If he had, what would it matter? An old man like him." "Oh, come, Sue, he's not so very old. And I know what I saw him doing. Not kissing me, that I'm certain." "No, but putting his arm round your waist." "Ah, I remember. But I didn't know he was going to." "You are wriggling out of it, Sue, and it isn't quite kind." Her ever-sensitive lip began to quiver and her eye to blink at something this reproof was deciding her to say. "I know you'll be angry if I tell you everything, and that's why I don't want to." "Very well then, dear," he said soothingly. "I have no real right to ask you, and I don't wish to know." "I shall tell you," said she, with a perverseness that was part of her. "This is what I have done. I have promised that I will marry him when I come out of the training school 2 years hence, and have got my certificate. His plan being that we shall then take a large double school in a great town, he the boys and I the girls, as married school teachers often do, and make a good income between us." "Oh, Sue! But of course it is right. You couldn't have done better." He glanced at her, and their eyes met, the reproach in his own belying his words. Then he drew his hand quite away from hers, and turned his face in estrangement from her to the window. Sue regarded him passively without moving. "I knew you would be angry," she said with an air of no emotion whatever. "Very well, I am wrong, I suppose. I ought not to have let you come to see me. We had better not meet again, and we'll only correspond at long intervals on purely business matters." This was just the one thing he would not be able to bear, as she probably knew, and it brought him round at once. "Oh yes, we will," he said quickly. "Your being engaged can make no difference to me whatever. I have a perfect right to see you when I want to, and I shall." "Then don't let us talk of it any more. It is quite spoiling our evening together. What does it matter about what one is going to do 2 years hence?" Sue was something of a riddle to him, and he let the subject drift away. "Shall we go and sit in the cathedral?" he asked, when their meal was finished. "Cathedral? Yes." "Though I think I'd rather sit in the railway station," she answered, a remnant of vexation still in her voice. "That's the centre of the town life now. The cathedral has had its day." "How modern you are!" "So would you be if you had lived so much in the Middle Ages as I have done these last few years. The cathedral was a very good place 4 or 5 centuries ago, but it is played out now. I am not modern either. I am more ancient than medievalism, if you only knew." Jude looked distressed. "There, I won't say any more of that," she cried. "Only you don't know how bad I am from your point of view, or you wouldn't think so much of me, or care whether I was engaged or not." Now there's just time for us to walk round the close, then I must go in, or I shall be locked out for the night." He took her to the gate, and they parted. Jude had a conviction that his unhappy visit to her on that sad night had precipitated this marriage engagement, and it did anything but add to his happiness. Her reproach had taken that shape then, and not the shape of words. However, next day he set about seeking employment, which it was not so easy to get as at Christminster, there being, as a rule, less stone-cutting in progress in this quiet city, and hands being mostly permanent. But he edged himself in by degrees. His first work was some carving at the cemetery on the hill, and ultimately he became engaged on the labour he most desired, the cathedral repairs, which were very extensive, the whole interior stonework having been overhauled to be largely replaced by new. It might be a labour of years to get it all done, and he had confidence enough in his own skill with the mallet and chisel to feel that it would be a matter of choice with himself how long he would stay. The lodgings he took near the close gate would not have disgraced a curate, the rent representing a higher percentage on his wages than mechanics of any sort usually care to pay. His combined bed and sitting-room was furnished with framed photographs of the rectories and deaneries at which his landlady had lived as trusted servant in her time, and the parlour downstairs bore a clock on the mantelpiece inscribed to the effect that it was presented to the same serious-minded woman by her fellow-servants on the occasion of her marriage. Jude added to the furniture of his own room by unpacking photographs of the ecclesiastical carvings and monuments that he had executed with his own hands, and he was deemed a satisfactory acquisition as tenant of the vacant apartment. He found an ample supply of theological books in the city bookshops, and with these his studies were recommenced in a different spirit and direction from his former course. As a relaxation from the Fathers and such stock works as Paley and Butler, he read Newman, Pusey, and many other modern lights. He hired a harmonium, set it up in his lodging, and practised chants thereon, single and double. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "Tomorrow is our grand day, you know. Where shall we go?" "I have leave from 3 till 9. Wherever we can get to and come back from in that time. No ruins, Jude. I don't care for them." "Well, Wardour Castle, then." "And then we can do Fonthill if we like, all in the same afternoon." "Wardour Castle is Gothic ruins, and I hate Gothic." "No, quite otherwise. It is a classic building, Corinthian, I think, with a lot of pictures." "Ah, that will do. I like the sound of Corinthian. We'll go." Their conversation had run thus some few weeks later, and next morning they prepared to start. Every detail of the outing was a facet reflecting a sparkle to Jude, and he did not venture to meditate on the life of inconsistency he was leading. His Sue's conduct was the one lovely conundrum to him. He could say no more. There duly came the charm of calling at the college door for her, her emergence in an unlike simplicity of costume that was rather enforced than desired, the traipsing along to the station, the porters "by your leave," the screaming of the trains, everything formed the basis of a beautiful crystallization. Nobody stared at Sue because she was so plainly dressed, which comforted Jude in the thought that only himself knew the charms those habiliments subdued. A matter of £10 spent in a drapery shop, which had no connection with her real life or her real self, would have set all Melchester staring. The guard of the train thought they were lovers, and put them into a compartment all by themselves. "That's a good intention wasted," said she. Jude did not respond. He thought the remark unnecessarily cruel, and partly untrue. They reached the park and castle, and wandered through the picture galleries, Jude stopping by preference in front of the devotional pictures by Del Sarto, Guido Reni, Spagnoletti, Sassoferrato, Carlo Dolci, and others. Sue paused patiently beside him, and stole critical looks into his face, as, regarding the Virgins, Holy Families, and Saints, it grew reverent and abstracted. When she had thoroughly estimated him at this, she would move on and wait for him beside a Lely or Reynolds. It was evident that her cousin deeply interested her, as one might be interested in a man puzzling out his way along a labyrinth from which one had oneself escaped. When they came out a long time still remained to them, and Jude proposed that as soon as they had had something to eat they should walk across the high country to the north of their present position, and intercept the train of another railway leading back to Melchester at a station about 7 miles off. Sue, who was inclined for any adventure that would intensify the sense of her day's freedom, readily agreed, and away they went, leaving the adjoining station behind them. It was indeed open country, wide and high. They talked and bounded on, Jude cutting from a little covert a long walking stick for Sue as tall as herself, with a great crook, which made her look like a shepherdess. About half-way on their journey they crossed the main road running due east and west, the old road from London to Land's End. They paused and looked up and down it for a moment, and remarked upon the desolation which had come over this once lively thoroughfare, while the wind dipped to earth and scooped straws and hay stems from the ground. They crossed the road and passed on, but during the next half-mile Sue seemed to grow tired, and Jude began to be distressed for her. They had walked a good distance altogether, and if they could not reach the other station it would be rather awkward. For a long time there was no cottage visible on the wide expanse of down and turnip land, but presently they came to a sheepfold, and next to the shepherd pitching hurdles. He told them that the only house near was his mother's and his, pointing to a little dip ahead from which a faint blue smoke arose, and recommended them to go on and rest there. This they did, and entered the house, admitted by an old woman without a single tooth, to whom they were as civil as strangers can be when their only chance of rest and shelter lies in the favour of the householder. "A nice little cottage," said Jude. "Oh, I don't know about the niceness. I shall have to thatch it soon, and where the thatch is to come from I can't tell, for straw to get that dear that will soon be cheaper to cover your house with chainy plates than thatch." They sat resting, and the shepherd came in. "Don't 'ee mind I," he said, with a deprecating wave of the hand. "Bide here as long as you will. But mid you be thinking of getting back to Melchester to night by train, because you'll never do it in this world since you don't know the lie of the country. I don't mind going with you some of the ways, but even then the train mid be gone." They started up. "You can bide here, you know, over the night, can't 'em, mother? The place is welcome to 'ee. 'Tis hard lying rather, but folk may do worse." He turned to Jude and asked privately, "Be you a married couple?" "Hush, no," said Jude. "Oh, I meant nothing bawdy, not I. Well then, she can go into mother's room, and you and I can lie in the outer chimmer after they've gone through. I can call ye soon enough to catch the first train back. You've lost this one now." On consideration they decided to close with this offer, and drew up and shared with the shepherd and his mother the boiled bacon and greens for supper. "I rather like this," said Sue while their entertainers were clearing away the dishes. "Outside all laws except gravitation and germination." "You only think you like it, you don't. You are quite a product of civilization," said Jude, a recollection of her engagement reviving his soreness a little. "Indeed I am not, Jude. I like reading and all that, but I crave to get back to the life of my infancy and its freedom. Do you remember it so well? You seem to me to have nothing unconventional at all about you." "Oh, haven't I? You don't know what's inside me." "What?" "The Ishmaelite." "An urban miss is what you are." She looked severe disagreement, and turned away. The shepherd aroused them the next morning, as he had said. It was bright and clear, and the 4 miles to the train were accomplished pleasantly. When they had reached Melchester, and walked to the Close, and the gables of the old building in which she was again to be immured rose before Sue's eyes, she looked a little scared. "I expect I shall catch it," she murmured. They rang the great bell and waited. "Oh, I brought something for you, which I had nearly forgotten," she said quickly, searching her pocket. "It is a new little photograph of me. Would you like it?" "Would I?" He took it gladly, and the porter came. There seemed to be an ominous glance on his face when he opened the gate. She passed in, looking back at Jude and waving her hand. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The 70 young women, of ages varying in the main from 19 to 21, though several were older, who at this date filled the species of nunnery known as the training school at Melchester, formed a very mixed community, which included the daughters of mechanics, curates, surgeons, shopkeepers, farmers, dairymen, soldiers, sailors, and villagers. They sat in the large schoolroom of the establishment on the evening previously described, and word was passed round that Sue Bridehead had not come in at closing time. "She went out with her young man," said a second-year student, who knew about young men, "and Miss Traceley saw her at the station with him. She'll have it hot when she does come." "She said he was her cousin," observed a youthful new girl. "That excuse has been made a little too often in this school to be effectual in saving our souls," said the head girl of the year, dryly. The fact was that only 12 months before there had occurred a lamentable seduction of one of the pupils, who had made the same statement in order to gain meetings with her lover. The affair had created a scandal, and the management had consequently been rough on cousins ever since. At 9 o'clock the names were called, Sue's being pronounced 3 times sonorously by Miss Traceley, without eliciting an answer. At 9:15 the 70 stood up to sing the evening hymn, and then knelt down to prayers. After prayers they went into supper, and every girl's thought was, "Where is Sue Bridehead?" Some of the students who had seen Jude from the window felt that they would not mind risking her punishment for the pleasure of being kissed by such a kindly-faced young man. Hardly one among them believed in the cousinship. Half an hour later they all lay in their cubicles, their tender feminine faces upturned to the flaring gas jets which at intervals stretched down the long dormitories, every face bearing the legend "The Weaker" upon it, as the penalty of the sex wherein they were moulded, which, by no possible exertion of their willing hearts and abilities, could be made strong while the inexorable laws of nature remain what they are. They formed a pretty, suggestive, pathetic sight, of whose pathos and beauty they were themselves unconscious, and would not discover till, amid the storms and strains of after years, with their injustice, loneliness, childbearing, and bereavement, their minds would revert to this experience as to something which had been allowed to slip past them insufficiently regarded. One of the mistresses came in to turn out the lights, and before doing so gave a final glance at Sue's cot, which remained empty, and at her little dressing-table at the foot, which, like all the rest, was ornamented with various girlish trifles, framed photographs being not the least conspicuous among them. Sue's table had a moderate show, 2 men in their filigree and velvet frames, standing together beside her looking-glass. "Who are these men? Did she ever say?" asked the mistress. "Strictly speaking, relations' portraits are only allowed on these tables, you know." "One, the middle-aged man," said a student in the next bed, "is the schoolmaster she served under, Mr. Phillotson." "And the other, this undergraduate in cap and gown, who is he?" "He is a friend, or was. She has never told his name." "Was it either of these 2 who came for her?" "No." "Are you sure 'twas not the undergraduate?" "Quite. He was a young man with a black beard." The lights were promptly extinguished, and till they fell asleep the girls indulged in conjectures about Sue, and wondered what games she had carried on in London and at Christminster before she came here, some of the more restless ones getting out of bed and looking from the mullioned windows at the vast west front of the cathedral opposite, and the spire rising behind it. When they awoke next morning they glanced into Sue's nook, to find it still without a tenant. After the early lessons by gaslight in half toilet, and when they had come up to dress for breakfast, the bell of the entrance gate was heard to ring loudly. The mistress of the dormitory went away, and presently came back to say that the principal orders were that nobody was to speak to Bridehead without permission. When, accordingly, Sue came into the dormitory to hastily tidy herself, looking flushed and tired, she went to her cubicle in silence, none of them coming out to greet her or to make inquiry. When they had gone downstairs they found that she did not follow them into the dining hall to breakfast, and they then learnt that she had been severely reprimanded and ordered to a solitary room for a week, there to be confined and take her meals and do all her reading. At this the 70 murmured, the sentence being, they thought, too severe. A round robin was prepared and sent in to the principal, asking for a remission of Sue's punishment. No notice was taken. Towards evening, when the geography mistress began dictating her subject, the girls in the class sat with folded arms. "You mean that you are not going to work?" said the mistress at last. "I may as well tell you that it has been ascertained that the young man Bridehead stayed out with was not her cousin, for the very good reason that she has no such relative. We have written to Christminster to ascertain. We are willing to take her word," said the head girl. "This young man was discharged from his work at Christminster for drunkenness and blasphemy in public houses, and he has come here to live entirely to be near her." However, they remained stolid and motionless, and the mistress left the room to inquire from her superiors what was to be done. Presently, towards dusk, the pupils, as they sat, heard exclamations from the first-year's girls in an adjoining class-room, and one rushed in to say that Sue Bridehead had got out of the back window of the room in which she had been confined, escaped in the dark across the lawn, and disappeared. How she had managed to get out of the garden nobody could tell, as it was bounded by the river at the bottom, and the side door was locked. They went and looked at the empty room, the casement between the middle mullions of which stood open. The lawn was again searched with a lantern, every bush and shrub being examined, but she was nowhere hidden. Then the porter of the front gate was interrogated, and on reflection he said that he remembered hearing a sort of splashing in the stream at the back, but he had taken no notice, thinking some ducks had come down the river from above. "She must have walked through the river," said a mistress. "Or drowned it herself," said the porter. The mind of the matron was horrified, not so much at the possible death of Sue as at the possible half-column detailing the event in all the newspapers, which, added to the scandal of the year before, would give the college an unenviable notoriety for many months to come. More lanterns were procured and the river examined, and then, at last, on the opposite shore, which was open to the fields, some little boot tracks were discerned in the mud, which left no doubt that the too excitable girl had waded through a depth of water reaching nearly to her shoulders, for this was the chief river of the county, and was mentioned in all the geography books with respect. As Sue had not brought disgrace upon the school by drowning herself, the matron began to speak superciliously of her, and to express gladness that she was gone. On the self-same evening Jude sat in his lodgings by the close gate. Often at this hour after dusk he would enter the silent close, and stand opposite the house that contained Sue, and watch the shadows of the girls' heads passing to and fro upon the blinds, and wish he had nothing else to do but sit reading and learning all day what many of the thoughtless inmates despised. But to-night, having finished tea and brushed himself up, he was deep in the perusal of the 29th volume of Pusey's Library of the Fathers, a set of books which he had purchased of a second-hand dealer at a price that seemed to him to be one of miraculous cheapness for that invaluable work. He fancied he heard something rattle lightly against his window. Then he heard it again. Certainly somebody had thrown gravel. He rose and gently lifted the sash. "Jude!" from below. "Sue?" "Yes, it is. Can I come up without being seen?" "Oh yes." "Then don't come down. Shut the window." Jude waited, knowing that she could enter easily enough, the front door being opened merely by a knob which anybody could turn, as in most old country towns. He palpitated at the thought that she had fled to him in her trouble as he had fled to her in his. What counterparts they were! He unlatched the door of his room, heard a stealthy rustle on the dark stairs, and in a moment she appeared in the light of his lamp. He went up to seize her hand, and found she was clammy as a marine deity, and that her clothes clung to her like the robes on the figures in the Parthenon frieze. "I'm so cold," she said through her chattering teeth. "Can I come by your fire, Jude?" She crossed to his little grate and very little fire, but as the water dripped from her as she moved, the idea of drying herself was absurd. "Whatever have you done, darling?" he asked with alarm, the tender epithet slipping out unawares. "Walked through the largest river in the county. That's what I've done. They locked me up for being out with you, and it seemed so unjust that I couldn't bear it, so I got out of the window and escaped across the stream." She had begun the explanation in her usual slightly independent tones, but before she had finished the thin pink lips trembled, and she could hardly refrain from crying. "Dear Sue," he said, "you must take off all your things. And let me see. You must borrow some from the landlady. I'll ask her." "No, no! Don't let her know, for God's sake! We are so near the school that they'll come after me." "Then you must put on mine. You don't mind?" "Oh, no." "My Sunday suit, you know. It is close here." In fact, everything was close and handy in Jude's single chamber, because there was not room for it to be otherwise. He opened a drawer, took out his best dark suit, and giving the garments a shake, said, "Now, how long shall I give you?" 10 minutes." Jude left the room and went into the street, where he walked up and down. A clock struck 7:30, and he returned. Sitting in his only arm-chair he saw a slim and fragile being masquerading as himself on a Sunday, so pathetic in her defencelessness that his heart felt big with the sense of it. On 2 other chairs before the fire were her wet garments. She blushed as he sat down beside her, but only for a moment. "I suppose, Jude, it is odd that you should see me like this, and all my things hanging there. Yet what nonsense! They are only a woman's clothes, sexless cloth and linen. I wish I didn't feel so ill and sick. Will you dry my clothes now? Please do, Jude, and I'll get a lodging by and by. It is not late yet." "No, you shan't, if you are ill. You must stay here. Dear, dear Sue, what can I get for you?" I don't know. I can't help shivering. I wish I could get warm." Jude put on her his greatcoat in addition, and then ran out to the nearest public house, whence he returned with a little bottle in his hand. "Here's 6 of best brandy," he said. "Now you drink it, dear, all of it." "I can't out of the bottle, can I?" Jude fetched a glass from the dressing-table, and administered the spirit in some water. She gasped a little, but gulped it down, and lay back in the arm-chair. She then began to relate circumstantially her experiences since they had parted, but in the middle of her story her voice faltered, her head nodded, and she ceased. She was in a sound sleep. Jude, dying of anxiety lest she should have caught a chill which might permanently injure her, was glad to hear the regular breathing. He softly went nearer to her, and observed that a warm flush now rosed her hitherto blue cheeks, and felt that her hanging hand was no longer cold. Then he stood with his back to the fire regarding her, and saw in her almost a divinity. End of chapter 3